On a bitterly cold winter night in the Yukon wilderness, the wind howled through the towering pines like a restless spirit. Snow blanketed the ground in a thick, unbroken sheet, save for the narrow path that led to a small, secluded cabin nestled deep in the heart of the forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the landscape, illuminating the skeletal branches of the trees that stood like silent sentinels around the dwelling. Inside the cabin, Ethan Walker sat hunched over a crackling fire, the orange glow flickering against his weathered face. He barely felt the warmth. The cold had long seeped into his bones, a permanent companion, much like the sorrow he carried. 2 years had passed since Clara was taken from him, yet the weight of her absence pressed against his chest like an unshakable burden. The world outside had moved on, but Ethan had not. He had chosen solitude over the pitying glances of neighbors, over the well-intended but hollow words of friends. Here, in the vast emptiness of the Yukon, he could exist without expectations, without forced conversations, without the constant reminder of what he had lost. The cabin was his refuge. The thick wooden walls shielded him from the biting wind, and the dim glow of the fire cast long, shifting shadows across the room, making the small space feel alive in a way that both comforted and unnerved him. The silence, once a sanctuary, now stretched endlessly, filling every corner, pressing against him like an invisible force. He often found himself talking aloud, filling the void with words that no one would ever hear. Sometimes he spoke to Clara. The storm had arrived with a vengeance. The wind shrieked through the towering pines like a wounded beast, rattling the small cabin as if trying to pry it apart. Snow whirled in frenzied spirals beyond the frost-coated windows, thick flakes lashing against the glass with a relentless fury. The world outside had vanished, swallowed by the storm's icy grip. Ethan Walker sat in his worn armchair by the fireplace, one hand curled around a glass of whiskey, the other resting on the thick wool blanket draped over his lap. The fire before him burned low, casting restless shadows across the log walls. He took a slow sip, the liquor burning a path down his throat, offering a fleeting warmth that had become more of a habit than a comfort. Outside, the storm raged on, a force of nature untamed and unyielding. It was the kind of night where no sane man would set foot beyond shelter, where even the wolves would retreat into their dens, waiting for the blizzard's fury to subside. Then he heard it. A sound, faint, nearly swallowed by the wind. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. He set his glass down on the wooden table beside him, listening intently. At first, he told himself it was just the storm, the wind playing tricks as it tore through the trees. It wouldn't be the first time. Living alone in the wilderness did strange things to a man's mind. Sometimes, the silence was so deep that it gave birth to phantom sounds, whispers, echoes of voices that weren't really there. But this was different. It came again, a distant, fragile cry carried on the wind, not the groan of bending trees or the whistle of the storm squeezing through cracks in the cabin's walls. It was something else, something human, a weak, desperate plea. Ethan's spine stiffened, a deep unease creeping through his veins. He turned toward the window, peering into the white void beyond the glass. Nothing but the endless swirl of snow and darkness. His pulse quickened. No one should be out there. Not in this weather. Not this far into the wilderness. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks, the isolation twisting reality. Maybe it was nothing at all. But what if it wasn't? A gnawing sense of responsibility gripped him, refusing to let go. What if someone was out there, lost, freezing on the brink of death? He had seen firsthand how unforgiving the Yukon winter could be. Out here, a single mistake could mean the difference between life and a frozen grave. Cursing under his breath, Ethan rose from his chair, his joints stiff from the cold. He moved to the peg by the door, pulling on his heavy coat, tugging on his thick gloves. The air inside the cabin was cold, but he knew it was nothing compared to the unforgiving night beyond these walls. He grabbed his lantern from the table, its weak flame barely a match for the storm, and stepped toward the door. His fingers hesitated on the handle. A part of him, the part that had learned long ago to trust his instincts, whispered that this was a mistake, that there was something unnatural about that sound. Another cry. Closer this time. Ethan's hesitation vanished. He pulled open the door, and the storm hit him like a living thing, an unrelenting force that stole his breath and burned his skin. Snow whipped against his face, the cold slicing through him like a blade. Ethan stepped onto the porch, and the storm hit him like a force of nature, slamming into his chest with a gust of wind so sharp it stole his breath. Snow whipped through the air in furious, swirling currents, stinging his exposed skin and blurring the world into a haze of white. He squinted into the darkness, his lantern barely casting a glow against the relentless storm. The sound had come from somewhere nearby, weak, desperate. He stepped forward cautiously, boots crunching through the thick snow, every movement slow and deliberate. He scanned the ground, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of whatever poor soul had cried out. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape against the white, small and unmoving, half buried in the snowdrift near the tree line. Ethan's pulse quickened as he approached, his instincts screaming for him to be cautious. As he drew closer, the shape took form, a tiny, trembling mass of fur, barely distinguishable against the storm. His breath caught. A bear cub. It was curled into itself, shivering violently, its fur crusted with ice. Its breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, each one a struggle. Snow had begun to gather over its body, as though the storm itself was trying to claim it, to bury it beneath the relentless winter. Ethan hesitated. Every rational thought in his mind told him not to interfere. A bear cub meant a mother wasn't far behind, and an encounter with a desperate, angry mother bear was the last thing he needed. His grip on the lantern tightened, scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement beyond the shifting shadows. But there was nothing. No guttural growl, no snapping branches, only the howling wind. Something was wrong. If the mother was nearby, she would have been here by now. A cub this young wouldn't be wandering alone. Not in this storm. Not in this kind of cold. Ethan swallowed, his gaze dropping back down to the tiny creature barely clinging to life at his feet. It lifted its head weakly, its half-closed eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. There was no fight left in them, no strength, just an unspoken plea, a silent surrender to the brutal reality of the wild. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had lived in these woods long enough to know how this story ended. If he walked away now, the cub wouldn't last another hour. The cold would take it, slowly, painfully. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself nature had its own way of dealing with things, that this was how the wild worked. And yet, his fingers were already moving before his mind could argue. He dropped to one knee, his thick gloves brushing against the frozen fur. The cub barely reacted, too weak to fight. Its small body was stiff, ice clinging to its coat in jagged clumps. "You won't survive if you stay here," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. Carefully, he unfastened the thick wool blanket slung over his shoulder, wrapping it around the cub's fragile frame. The moment his arms encased its trembling body, he felt just how cold it truly was. It wasn't just cold, it was near frozen. A deep pang of something unfamiliar twisted in his chest. Without another thought, he lifted the cub into his arms and turned back toward the cabin. The wind fought him, pushing against him like an unseen force, trying to keep him from leaving. Snow swirled furiously, blinding him as he trudged forward, every step a battle against the storm's wrath. Finally, the cabin's warm glow came into view, a beacon of refuge in the endless white. Ethan pushed forward, his boots hitting the wooden steps of the porch. He wrenched the door open with one hand, stepping inside and kicking it shut behind him. The cabin felt almost unbearably warm in comparison to the frozen world outside. Ethan wasted no time, moving swiftly to the hearth and kneeling beside the fire. He unwrapped the cub carefully, placing it near the heat but not too close. The little creature shuddered violently, barely clinging to consciousness. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. He had spent the last 2 years pushing the world away, burying himself in isolation, convincing himself that nothing and no one needed him anymore. And yet, here he was, holding the fragile thread of another life in his hands. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a heavy quilt, thick and comforting, a stark contrast to the howling storm outside. Snow still lashed against the window panes, the wind rattling the wooden walls. But inside, the battle for survival had already begun. Ethan knelt beside the fireplace, his breath shallow, watching the fragile bundle of fur curled on the floor. The bear cub lay motionless, except for the small tremors rippling through its tiny body. Its fur was damp, crusted with ice, each strand stiff with the unforgiving bite of winter. Carefully, Ethan reached out, his gloved fingers brushing along its back. The cub shivered but didn't flinch. It was too weak to protest, too cold to fear him. His hands moved with practiced precision, unwrapping the wool blanket he had bundled the cub in, replacing it with a thick, dry one. He worked quickly, wiping away the remnants of ice clinging to its fur, brushing off the last traces of snow. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of working with wood and steel, but his touch was gentle. The cub's tiny body radiated an unnatural chill, its breathing shallow and uneven. "You're not giving up on me now," Ethan muttered under his breath, though whether he was talking to the cub or himself he wasn't sure. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a golden glow. Slowly, warmth seeped into the cub's fragile frame, the violent tremors beginning to lessen. It let out a soft whimper, a sound so weak it barely reached Ethan's ears, but it was something, a sign of life. Ethan stood, stretching his aching knees, and moved to the small wooden kitchen tucked into the corner of the cabin. His mind raced, running through possibilities. What did a starving bear cub eat? He had no raw meat on hand, nothing substantial enough for an animal this size. But milk, warm, soothing, seemed like a place to start. He poured some into a bowl, breaking apart a piece of bread to soak in the liquid, softening it. The scent filled the cabin, mingling with the smoky aroma of the burning logs. Carefully, he carried the bowl back to the fire, setting it down just inches from the cub. The bear didn't move. Its small, round eyes, dark as polished stone, flickered open, locking onto him. It didn't blink, didn't flinch, just watched. There was something unsettling about that gaze, too knowing, too deep for something so young. It was not the wild, panicked look of an animal in fear. It was something else entirely, a silent plea. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back on his heels. "Go on," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You need to eat." The cub's tiny nose twitched, nostrils flaring slightly, but it made no effort to move. It simply continued watching him, eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. Ethan sighed, running a hand over his beard. He knew better than to expect instant trust. In the wild, trust was a foreign concept, an instinct dulled by survival, by necessity. And yet, the way the cub looked at him, the way it remained still under his touch, told him something else. It wanted to trust him. It just didn't know how. He settled down beside the fire, legs stretched out, arms resting on his knees. The minutes stretched on, marked only by the occasional crackle of the firewood and the distant howl of the wind outside. The storm raged, but here, inside these walls, time felt suspended. The cub shifted slightly, its tiny paws pressing weakly against the wool blanket beneath it. Its gaze flickered to the bowl, nostrils twitching again. Ethan remained still, barely breathing, watching as it hesitated, then, slowly, lowered its head toward the warm milk. It lapped at the liquid tentatively at first, then with more urgency, its tiny pink tongue darting out, tasting, drinking. Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's it," he murmured, slow and steady. The cub ate only a few mouthfuls before stopping, exhausted. Its eyes, still fixed on him, grew heavier, the warmth finally settling into its bones. Within moments, it curled its body tighter, tucking its small paws beneath its chin. Ethan didn't move. He remained seated by the fire, watching the cub, listening to its soft, steady breathing. The room felt smaller, quieter, the weight of the storm outside pressing against the wooden walls. For the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't alone. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat beside the fire, keeping watch over the fragile creature beside him. The wind screamed outside, but inside, wrapped in the golden glow of the fire, two survivors clung to the warmth. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, marked by the crackling of the fire and the slow return of life to the fragile creature Ethan had pulled from the snow. At first, Coda, though Ethan had yet to call him that, was weak, barely able to lift his head. His breaths had been shallow, his small body limp and unresponsive. But Ethan had seen something in those dark eyes, something stubborn, something that refused to give up. And the cub hadn't. Each day, strength returned to him, little by little. His limbs grew steadier, his appetite fiercer. At first, Ethan had to coax him to eat, dipping his fingers in warm milk, letting the cub lick it off before guiding him to the bowl. But soon, hunger overcame caution, and Coda, yes, that would be his name, began to eat with growing enthusiasm, small paws pressing against the wooden floor as he lapped up every last drop. Ethan caught himself watching more than he should have. The first time the cub tried to stand on his own, it had been an unsteady, clumsy affair. He wobbled like a newborn fawn, paws slipping on the smooth wooden floor, his small claws scrabbling for purchase. Ethan had chuckled despite himself, an unfamiliar sound after so many silent nights. By the end of the week, Coda was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. The once fragile cub began exploring the cabin with an endearing curiosity, sniffing at everything, pawing at Ethan's boots with tiny but determined swipes. He was bold but clumsy, frequently tumbling over his own feet, only to shake himself off and try again. One evening, as Ethan sat by the fire, a thick mitten dangling from his fingers, Coda's gaze locked onto it, his round eyes narrowing in focused determination. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You want this?" he asked, shaking the mitten slightly. Coda crouched low, his tiny hindquarters wiggling in an unmistakable display of mischief. A grin tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Without warning, Coda pounced. His small body launched through the air, paws outstretched, and he landed, almost, on the mitten, sliding a few inches across the wooden floor. Ethan let out a bark of laughter, a sound that startled him as much as it did the cub. For the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin didn't feel empty. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching as Coda batted at the mitten, his small claws hooking into the fabric as he chewed and wrestled with it. The fire flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. But for once, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't oppressive. It was filled with something else. Warmth, life, a presence that, for the first time in years, made Ethan feel like he wasn't just existing, but living. He exhaled slowly, glancing at the small creature now curled at his feet, his tiny body rising and falling in deep, contented sleep. "Coda," Ethan murmured, testing the name on his tongue. It felt right. A name for a cub who had fought to survive, just as Ethan had. A name for something small, yet strong. A name for a soul that had found its way into his home, into his heart, whether he had planned for it or not. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, gazing into the fire. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The snow melted slowly, giving way to the first tender hints of spring. The icy grip that had held the Yukon in silence for months began to loosen, and the forest stirred with new life. Birds returned, their songs threading through the trees like whispers of an old melody. Rivers swelled with melted snow, carving new paths through the land. The days grew longer, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Ethan watched it all from his cabin, knowing what it meant. It was time. For months, Coda had been his companion, his shadow, his unexpected family. The once frail cub had grown into a strong young bear, his fur thick and glossy, his limbs powerful. He was no longer the tiny, trembling creature Ethan had found buried in the snow. He had become something wild again, something that belonged beyond these wooden walls. Ethan had always known this day would come. He had promised himself he wouldn't grow attached, that he wouldn't let his heart open. And yet here he was, standing on his porch, watching Coda play one last time, batting at a loose strap on Ethan's pack, his round eyes filled with mischief, unaware of what was coming. Ethan swallowed hard. "Come on, little one," he murmured. Coda tilted his head at the familiar words but followed without hesitation as Ethan led him toward the truck. The drive was quiet. The winding road stretched ahead, flanked by towering pines and rolling hills thawing under the touch of spring. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched. Coda sat in the back, his nose pressed against the small window, watching the world blur past. By the time they reached the forest near Lake Cluane, the sun hung high in the sky, golden light spilling over the vast expanse of trees. Ethan pulled to a stop at the forest's edge, where the land stretched wild and unbroken, a place where other bears roamed, where Coda would have a chance to be what he was meant to be. The door creaked as Ethan stepped out, his boots crunching against damp earth. Coda followed, hopping down effortlessly. He landed softly, sniffing the air, ears twitching as he took in the sense of the untamed world before him. Ethan let out a slow breath. "This is it," he said, voice low. Coda turned to him as if sensing something was different. His dark eyes met Ethan's, searching, questioning. Ethan crouched down, resting a hand against Coda's thick fur. "Go on, little one. This is where you belong." The words scraped against his throat. He hadn't realized how hard it would be to say them. Coda hesitated, his small, powerful body tensed as he looked back at the trees, then at Ethan. His nose twitched, nostrils flaring as if trying to memorize his scent. Ethan gave him a gentle push. "Go." The young bear took a few tentative steps forward, his large paws pressing into the soft earth. Then he stopped, turning his head one last time. For a long moment they just stared at each other. And then, just as suddenly as he had entered Ethan's life, Coda turned and disappeared into the dense forest, his dark form melting into the trees. Ethan stood motionless, his heart aching in a way he hadn't expected. But just before Coda vanished completely, he did something Ethan would never forget. He glanced back one last time. It was brief, but it was there. A final look, a silent thank you. And then he was gone. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. The wind rustled the trees, whispering through the leaves. Ethan turned, heading back toward his truck. The cabin would feel empty again. The silence would return. But for the first time in years, he knew it wouldn't feel quite so lonely. The forest had changed with the season. The towering pines swayed gently in the warm summer breeze, their green needles glistening under the golden sunlight that filtered through the canopy. The scent of damp earth and wildflowers filled the air, a stark contrast to the frozen silence of the winter months Ethan had endured alone. Birds flitted through the trees, their calls mingling with the rustling of leaves. Ethan walked along the familiar winding path near his cabin, his rifle slung across his back, not for hunting but for safety. These woods had been his refuge for years, his sanctuary away from the noise of the world. But today, something felt different. Something pulled at the edges of his awareness, an unshakable feeling that he wasn't alone. He slowed his steps, scanning the dense thickets ahead. The trees whispered in the breeze, but beneath their rustling, something else stirred. A presence, a shadow moving between the trunks. Ethan's breath caught. A large, familiar figure emerged from the underbrush, stepping onto the path with effortless grace. Coda. Ethan froze. His heart pounded against his ribs, disbelief washing over him. But there was no mistaking the dark fur, thick and glossy now. No longer the matted coat of the fragile cub he had once nursed by the fire. Coda had grown into a magnificent young bear, his muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat, his eyes bright and intelligent. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, two souls meeting again after a lifetime apart. Then, Ethan noticed something else, two smaller figures trailing behind Coda, their small round ears twitching, their dark eyes filled with curiosity. Bear cubs. Ethan swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat. Coda had survived. Not just survived, he had thrived. He had found a new life, built a family of his own. The realization struck Ethan with the force of a storm. He had feared, after letting Coda go, that he would never know what became of him. The wilderness was harsh, unforgiving. But here he was, strong, alive, and not alone. The two cubs peeked from behind their mother, their noses twitching as they studied Ethan. They were young, their fur still soft, their limbs slightly unsteady, and yet they showed no fear. Coda watched Ethan carefully, his deep eyes unreadable, but there was something in them, something that wasn't quite wild. A flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement. Ethan took a slow step forward. Coda didn't move. He simply stood there, letting the moment stretch between them. The weight of it all pressed against Ethan's chest. The cold winter night he had found Coda half buried in the snow, the long months of watching over him, the moment he had let him go. And now, here they were, standing on the same earth once again, their stories intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. A slow, bittersweet smile pulled at the corners of Ethan's lips. "You did it, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You made it." Coda huffed softly, a sound almost like a sigh, before nudging one of the cubs forward. The little one hesitated before taking a cautious step, sniffing the air. The other followed, their tiny paws pressing into the dirt, leaving delicate imprints along the forest floor. Ethan's eyes burned, his vision blurring for just a moment. Coda hadn't just survived. He had come back, to show Ethan that he hadn't failed, that his choice to let go hadn't been a loss but a gift. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something deep within him shift, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Clara's passing. Hope. Coda let out a final huff before turning, his cubs following his lead. Ethan didn't call out, didn't step forward. This time he didn't have to. He simply watched as Coda disappeared into the trees, knowing without a doubt that this was not the end, only the beginning. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest long after Coda and his cubs had disappeared into the wilderness. The wind whispered through the towering trees, rustling the leaves like a quiet song meant only for those who took the time to listen. It had taken him years to understand what that moment truly meant. Coda had been more than a bear cub he had saved from the cold that fateful winter night. He had been more than just a companion during the long, lonely months in the cabin. Coda was a symbol, a reminder that even in the deepest, darkest moments of loss, life had a way of finding its path forward. Ethan had spent years building walls around himself, shutting out the world, convinced that his grief was too heavy to carry anywhere but alone. But Coda had come into his life like a whisper of fate, unplanned, unexpected, a fragile creature who had needed Ethan as much as Ethan had needed him. Through Coda, he had learned to care again. He had learned that even the most broken souls could heal, not by forgetting the past, but by allowing life to continue, by letting love in, even in its smallest, most unexpected forms. Coda had left, but he had also returned. Not just as a full-grown bear, but as a reminder of the lesson Ethan had been too stubborn to accept before. That love, in all its forms, was never truly lost. It simply changed, grew, and found new ways to exist. A lump rose in Ethan's throat as he took one last look at the spot where Coda had stood, remembering the tiny, trembling cub he had once cradled in his arms, the cub that had grown strong, the cub that had built a family of his own. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, my friend, for showing me the way back to life." And with that, Ethan turned and walked back toward his cabin, the weight on his heart lighter than it had been in years. If you've made it this far, I hope this story resonated with you. Life is unpredictable, full of loss and love, grief and healing. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, we find something or someone that reminds us how to keep moving forward. Coda wasn't just a bear. He was a second chance, a quiet lesson wrapped in fur and paws. And maybe, just maybe, we all have a Coda waiting for us somewhere. Some sign that life isn't done with us yet. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you have your own stories of second chances, of healing, of resilience, share them in the comments below.